It was the kind of trip I had always wanted to take. No real plan, no destination other than just getting out into the wild, leaving behind the distractions of everyday life. I had done plenty of solo camping before, but this time was different. I was going deep into the backwoods of north-central Pennsylvania, an area I'd never explored before, the kind of place where few people ever set foot, far removed from any developed trails or campgrounds. The drive was long and winding. I spent over an hour bumping along dirt roads, following faded signs that led deeper into the forest. The road became increasingly narrow, the trees growing thicker on either side until I couldn't see anything but the towering pines and spruces. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The gravel road was barely wide enough for my truck, and as I reached the end of it, I parked on the side of the road. The only sound was the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The peacefulness, the silence. It was a long way from anywhere. There was something calming about that isolation, but at the same time, something unsettling. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and set off on foot. The trailhead was faint, barely visible through the overgrowth. It was a path that hadn't been maintained in years. It was more of an old deer trail than a proper hiking path, winding through the thick brush, the ground uneven and rocky. I had a compass and a map, but neither seemed very helpful as the trail was all but swallowed up by the forest. It wasn't long before I found myself pushing through dense ferns and stepping over fallen logs. Every step was slow, deliberate. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to close in on me. The trail followed a creek down into a narrow valley. The creek gurgled quietly beside me, its water clear and cold, cutting through the landscape in a series of sharp bends. The rocks underfoot were slick with moss, and the trail wasn't flat. Now and then it would drop steeply, then climb back up again, making my progress slow. I didn't mind, though. I wasn't in a hurry. As I moved deeper into the woods, the signs of human activity became less frequent. The trail grew overgrown, and I couldn't find any footprints, no sign that anyone had been there in months. The only things moving through the woods were the occasional bird or squirrel, skittering off as I approached. Hours passed, and the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. I knew I needed to find a place to camp before it got dark. I wasn't far from the creek now, and I began to keep an eye out for a flat spot to set up camp. The idea of spending the night out here, alone in the middle of nowhere, was starting to feel more real. I wasn't scared, not yet, but the solitude was thick, almost tangible. That's when I came across the fork in the creek. The water split into two smaller streams, creating a natural clearing on the other side. The ground was flat and open, just what I was looking for. There was a small stone fire ring by the water's edge, surrounded by a few large boulders. The place felt comfortable, if not a little odd. I crossed the creek, stepping carefully on the rocks to avoid getting my boots wet, and made my way toward the camp spot. The first thing that caught my eye was a tarp on the ground, lying haphazardly beside the fire ring. It wasn't just any tarp, though. It looked like it had been used before, possibly for shelter, and was now weathered and worn. My instincts told me that someone had been here recently, but the lack of footprints around the tarp made it hard to pinpoint when. I continued to look around, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. There was a log nearby, about a foot in diameter, that had clearly been chopped with an axe. It was fresh, the cut still showing the raw wood beneath, a sign that someone had been here and used the area not too long ago. Then, I spotted something that made my heart skip. Just a few feet away, the entire contents of what you'd expect to find in a hiker's backpack were scattered on the ground. Food, a cooking set, a rolled-up sleeping pad, even a first aid kit. But there was no backpack. The items were just thrown about carelessly, like someone had left in a hurry. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down, running my fingers over the items. The first aid kit was still sealed, the food was mostly intact, but everything looked strange, like it had been left in a hurry, but also like the person who left it had taken time to scatter things deliberately. I stood up and moved away from the gear, my eyes scanning the rest of the area. Down by the creek, I saw a pile of clothes that had clearly been left out to dry. The clothes were soaked from the previous night's rain and looked like they had been sitting there for at least a day or two. A towel hung from a nearby tree, its edges frayed, as if it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. I felt uneasy now. This was strange, very strange. Who had left all this behind? Why were they in such a hurry? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. As I continued to explore the area, I found something even stranger. Off to one side, partially hidden by the brush, was a small wooden structure. It was made of saplings, about 4 feet square, and tied together with crude knots. The saplings were arranged to form a frame, like the edges of a cube, with diagonal crossbars on each face. It looked like a cage, but there were large gaps between the saplings, and it wasn't sturdy at all. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. It wasn't big enough to hold anything, and certainly not strong enough. It looked like a poorly built trap or some kind of primitive structure. My first thought was that it could have been used to trap animals, but it was far too flimsy. I wondered if it was a makeshift shelter, but why would someone build a shelter like this? It didn't make sense. The daylight was quickly fading, and I knew I needed to set up camp. I hadn't planned on staying in this spot, but there was no way I was hiking back out in the dark, not with the trail being as overgrown as it was. I decided to make the best of it and set up camp by the creek. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but what could I do? It was either stay and deal with it or hike out, and that wasn't an option. Not at this hour. I pulled out my tent, set it up quickly, and gathered some wood for a fire. I didn't feel comfortable being out here without one. As the fire crackled, I kept thinking about the strange things I had found. The scattered gear, the clothes, the odd cage. It was all too much. I had a 12-inch knife on me, and I kept it close the entire time. I'm not a paranoid person by nature, but there was something unsettling about the whole situation. I kept hearing noises, twigs breaking, branches creaking, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. But every time I'd look, there would be nothing there. The night dragged on and I barely slept. I kept imagining someone crazy, sneaking up on me in the dark. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been here before me might be nearby. Maybe they'd left in a hurry because something had scared them off, or maybe they were still out there watching me. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself clutching my knife like it was the only thing keeping me safe. I kept thinking about the cage, about what it might have been used for, and about the person who might have built it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, trying to stay as calm as possible. I kept looking over my shoulder as I worked, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The place was as quiet as it had been the day before. I took one last look around the area, making sure I hadn't left anything behind, and then I hiked out. As I walked along the trail, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, as if expecting someone, or something, to be following me. When I reached my truck, I was more than ready to leave. I didn't even stop to take in the scenery. I just got in, started the engine, and drove away, not looking back. Later, I called the Forest Service and reported what I had found. I even sent them photos of the cage and the gear. They said they'd send a ranger to check it out, but I never followed up. The ranger on the phone said it was probably someone living out in the woods or maybe someone growing something illegal. He wasn't sure, but he promised they'd investigate. To this day, I still don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was just some loner living off the land. Maybe it was something worse. But the cage? That still bugs me. It wasn't just some random thing. It had a purpose, and I don't think I want to know what it was. I decided on a whim to take a solo camping trip. It had been a stressful few months, and the constant noise of the city, the daily grind, was wearing me down. So one Friday afternoon, I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a few days worth of food, and drove out to a place I had heard about but never been to before. A remote section of forest, tucked away in the hills. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, and isolated, just what I needed. The drive out was longer than I expected. The roads were winding, narrow, and hardly anyone else was on them. As the sun began to set, I reached the entrance to the trailhead and parked the car. There were no other vehicles around, which only made it feel more isolated. I double-checked my gear, grabbed my backpack, and set off down the path, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. I wasn't entirely inexperienced in the woods. I had camped a few times before, and I knew how to set up a tent and start a fire. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the feeling of being alone started to creep in. It wasn't a fear I usually had, but there was something different about this place. The trees here seemed thicker, the air heavier, and even though it was late afternoon, it felt like dusk already. I eventually found a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. There was a stream nearby, a few rocks to sit on, and enough space to pitch my tent without too much hassle. I dropped my pack, sat down on one of the rocks, and took a deep breath, letting the peace of the forest wash over me. I felt a little more at ease. Setting up the tent was easy enough. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and made sure everything was in place. Once the tent was up, I built a small fire pit, arranging rocks around it. The sunlight had all but disappeared by now, and the air was growing colder, so I got to work on gathering some firewood. As I bent over to pick up a few sticks, I noticed something odd. There was a strange smell in the air, earthy, but with a sharp, almost metallic tang to it. I shrugged it off at first, figuring it was just the smell of the woods. But as I stood up, I noticed something else. There were marks on the ground, faint and almost unnoticeable, leading off into the trees. At first, I thought they were just animal tracks, perhaps a deer or something similar. But as I followed them with my eyes, I realized they weren't tracks at all. They were more like dragged marks, as if something heavy had been pulled through the dirt. A chill ran down my spine. My first instinct was to ignore it, to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the smell, the marks, they didn't sit right with me. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind as I finished gathering wood and got the fire started. The crackling of the flames made me feel a little better, but not much. Nightfall settled in quickly, and soon I was sitting around the fire, the only light in the otherwise pitch-black woods. I ate a quick meal, more out of habit than hunger, and then leaned back against a tree, staring up at the stars. The air was still, the kind of stillness you only get when you're far away from civilization. No cars, no noise, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the night wore on, I started to feel it, the isolation. It wasn't the kind of peaceful solitude I was hoping for. Instead, it felt oppressive, like something was lurking just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. Around midnight, I started hearing noises in the woods. Soft at first, like the wind shifting through the trees. But then there was something else. A subtle crack of a branch, a rustle of leaves, too deliberate to be the wind. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But the sound came again, this time closer. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the tree line, but I saw nothing. The woods were still, silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then the smell came again, stronger this time. It was unmistakable now. That sharp, metallic scent. I could feel my stomach tighten as I looked around, my pulse quickening. The sound, the smell, it was all too much. Something was out there. I spent the next few hours in a state of high alert, jumping at every little sound. My mind raced through possibilities. What if someone else was out here? What if I wasn't alone after all? I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, that it was the isolation getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around 2 a.m., I decided to check the area around my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and a small hatchet just in case. My heart pounded as I slowly made my way toward the edge of the clearing. I shone the flashlight around, scanning the trees and the ground. The marks in the dirt were still there, more obvious in the light now. They led further into the woods, deeper than I had noticed before. I followed them against my better judgment. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn in, like something was pulling me toward it. The smell grew stronger the deeper I went, and I started to hear the softest sounds, scratching, like something dragging along the ground. I rounded a bend in the path and stopped dead in my tracks. In the middle of the trail, partially hidden by the underbrush, was a pile of bones. Not animal bones, these were too large, too human. They were old, bleached white by the sun, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the bones. They were scattered haphazardly, as if someone had just left them there. I quickly backed away, my mind racing. I needed to leave, I needed to get out of here, but I couldn't. I was frozen. I turned and hurried back toward the camp, my heart pounding in my ears. The fire was still burning, but it felt small now, like it was barely enough to ward off the darkness. I collapsed back into my seat by the fire, trying to steady my breathing. But my mind kept racing back to the bones, to the dragging marks in the dirt, to the smell. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was already packing up my things, not caring how rushed I looked. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent into its bag. I was already planning my escape, my car, the road back home. But as I loaded everything up, something in the distance caught my eye. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. I froze, staring at it. It didn't move, didn't seem to notice me at all. It was just there, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the forest. And then it disappeared, slipping back into the woods, as if it had never been there. I didn't wait another minute. I grabbed my bag and sprinted back to my car, not caring about being quiet or cautious anymore. The drive back felt like it took forever, my mind replaying every moment of the night, every sound, every smell. The woods had felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. And now, as I looked back at them from the rearview mirror, I realized I had barely scratched the surface of whatever was lurking out there. By the time I got home, the sense of unease hadn't left me. If anything, it had only grown stronger. I don't know what I saw in the woods that night or what I was meant to find, but I do know one thing: I'll never go back. It was one of those weekends where I just needed to get away. The pressure from work was building up, and the constant noise of the city was starting to drive me mad. So I decided to go camping alone, deep into the woods, where I could be left in peace for a couple of days. There was a spot I had visited a few times before, a small, secluded place by a creek, far enough from any trails that it wasn't frequented by many people. Perfect for what I needed, a break from everything. I packed my tent, some food, a couple of liters of water, and a sleeping bag. I didn't bring much, just the essentials. It wasn't a long trip, maybe 3 or 4 hours by car and then a short hike in. I knew the route and I was familiar with the area. Felt good to escape, even if only for a short while. When I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the forest. I felt that familiar excitement as I pulled on my backpack and began the hike in. The trail was quiet, save for the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, serene, and for the first time in weeks, I felt myself starting to relax. The hike was mostly downhill, with the ground covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that softened each step. The air smelled fresh and earthy, with the faint scent of moss. The further I went in, the quieter it became. There were no other hikers, no sounds of cars or people. It was just me and the wilderness. I reached my camping spot as the last light of the day faded from the sky. It was a small clearing by the creek, with a few large rocks scattered around, perfect for sitting and relaxing by the water. I set up my tent quickly, the familiar motions calming my mind as I worked. The tent went up without a hitch, and soon enough, I had a small campfire going, the flames crackling softly in the silence of the forest. I roasted some sausages and settled down to eat, enjoying the solitude. As night fully settled in, the temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself in a jacket. I could hear the sounds of the creek running nearby, the occasional rustle of a creature moving through the underbrush, and the soft calls of night birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After eating, I cleaned up and stashed my food away in the bear bag I always carried with me. It was an extra precaution, even though I knew there were no bears in this area. I wasn't far from a small town, but I had seen signs of deer, coyotes, and other animals. I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The fire burned low, and I lay back on the ground, staring up at the stars through the branches above me. There were no clouds in the sky, and the stars shone brightly, their cold light making the dark forest seem even darker. I tried to relax, but something felt off. It wasn't a feeling I could place, but it was there, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing up without any reason. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks. I had been alone for a long time, after all. I turned over and rolled up into my sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped further, and the cold seeped into my bones. As I tried to get comfortable, I kept hearing odd sounds coming from the woods. The occasional twig snapping, a faint rustling that seemed too deliberate. Animals, I told myself, just animals. But it didn't feel like animals. There was something about it, something that didn't sit right. My mind wandered back to the bear bag I had hung up earlier, just a few yards from my tent. I wondered if I had tied it up tight enough. The thought of a bear, or even something smaller, getting into it made me uneasy. But no, I told myself again. There were no bears around here. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, though it wasn't the peaceful, deep sleep I had hoped for. Every small noise pulled me from my dreams, and I found myself waking up in the dark, listening to the sounds around me. The air was colder now, and the silence seemed deeper than before. I couldn't remember falling asleep, but I must have. At one point, I woke up to the sound of something moving near my tent. It was the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs, but it wasn't fast or erratic like an animal. It was slow and deliberate, almost like someone or something was trying to be quiet but wasn't succeeding. My heart skipped a beat. I lay there listening, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The sound continued, circling my tent, moving just out of sight. I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to identify what it was. I knew it wasn't a deer or a raccoon. The noise was too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the door, being as quiet as I could. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The clearing around my tent was empty, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. I stood there for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and unease. Maybe it was just my imagination, but as I stood there, staring into the dark, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. It was coming from the other side of my tent, just out of sight. I froze. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind and the rustling of leaves. But then the sound came again, closer this time, almost like someone was dragging something heavy through the dirt. It was too much to ignore now. I felt a knot of fear form in my stomach. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the spot where the noise was coming from. The beam swept over the ground, hitting the underbrush and the trees, but there was still nothing. No movement, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Yet the dragging sound continued. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't about to leave the safety of my tent, not with whatever that was out there. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't something natural. It wasn't an animal. Whatever it was deliberate and patient. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin, trying to ignore the sounds. But every few minutes, the dragging noise would start again, sometimes near the edge of the tent, sometimes farther away, but always there. I don't know how much time passed before I heard the crunch of leaves again, much closer this time, followed by something that sounded like a low, guttural breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the urge to jump up and run. I knew that if I did, whatever it was out there would hear me. I kept my flashlight aimed at the entrance of the tent, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing came. The sound of the dragging stopped. The night grew even quieter, the only sound the occasional wind rustling through the trees. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, though I kept waking up throughout the night, every noise making me alert again. But as the sun began to rise, I felt the tension in my body slowly ease. The strange noises had stopped, and for the first time since I arrived, the forest felt normal again. I packed up my camp slowly, still cautious, constantly scanning the trees and underbrush. I wasn't sure what I had heard or what had been out there, but I knew one thing: I wasn't coming back. The wilderness had a way of making you feel small, like you were just a visitor in someone else's home. But last night, it felt different. Felt like something was watching me. By the time I finished packing, the morning fog had burned off, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and distant animals. The walk back to the trailhead was uneventful, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I reached my car, I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I looked back toward the woods, a shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what had happened out there, but I wasn't eager to find out. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the trees behind me. But all I saw was the empty stretch of forest, stretching on endlessly. And in that moment, I realized that whatever had been out there, it wasn't something I would ever understand. But it had been real, and it had been close. I work as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California. It's one of those places tucked far back into the woods, the kind of camp where your phone signal dies 10 minutes before you even hit the parking lot. It's surrounded by dense pine and oak forests that stretch on for miles in every direction, broken up by rugged hills and dry creek beds. We get the usual assortment of wild animals wandering through: deer grazing just outside the cabins at dusk, red foxes darting through the brush, coyotes howling from the distant ridges. There's even been a couple of mountain lion sightings in the past few years, though nothing ever came close enough to really worry about. The place is rustic and beautiful, but also, in a quiet way, unsettling. It's not haunted in the storybook sense, but it has a vibe to it. There are areas of the forest that feel off, even in broad daylight. Certain trees grow twisted, almost leaning away from something, and there are patches where no birds sing, no insects buzz, just silence. A few times I've stumbled on old stone foundations buried in the undergrowth, cracked slabs of concrete or bricks arranged in rough patterns. Signs that someone, long before us, lived out here. We tell the campers they're remnants of a mining operation or maybe early settlers, but no one really knows. There's a story for everything at camp, and most of them are passed around for laughs during campfires. Still, some stories have teeth. That summer was a hot one, the kind of heat that seeps into your skin and stays there. I'd been working as a counselor for a few seasons by then and was pretty used to the schedule. Wake up before dawn, get the kids ready, spend the day running activities, and try not to pass out from exhaustion by nightfall. We rotated night duties, making sure someone was always on call while the rest tried to sleep. The nights could be rough. Everything got quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The forest would hum and crackle with life, and sometimes you'd hear things moving just beyond the lantern light. It wasn't scary exactly, just a constant reminder that we were out there, surrounded by nature, and nature didn't care much about our schedules. One night, I had just gotten my kids to bed. They were younger, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and completely wiped from a full day of swimming and hiking. After they'd settled in, I stepped outside for some air and found another counselor, Jackson, leaning against the rail of the cabin deck, sipping from a water bottle. We just stood there, both staring out into the dark tree line that wrapped around camp like a thick wall. Then suddenly, this blur of motion came sprinting across the path in front of us. It was Sadie, another counselor, and behind her, the entire group of teenage girls she was in charge of. There were maybe a dozen of them, all wearing black sweatshirts and leggings, their faces wide-eyed and panicked. They looked like they were in the middle of some themed activity, but the fear on their faces wasn't for show. Sadie was fast, running in long strides, her hair bouncing behind her. As she passed us, she glanced back and shouted something. I couldn't catch all of it, but I clearly heard the word ghost and something about meeting back later. Then they were gone, disappearing into the cluster of cabins up the hill. Now, Sadie's not the type to freak out. She's always been the calm one, good with emergencies, great with the kids, and the one who usually tells others to relax. Seeing her panic like that flipped something in my stomach. Jackson and I just stood there for a second, looking at each other, and then shrugged it off. There wasn't much we could do right then, so I told him I'd wait for Sadie and get the full story later. About 30 minutes later, after everything had settled down again, Sadie came back. She was still in her all-black outfit, though now she looked more annoyed than scared. She explained what had happened. Earlier that evening, she'd taken her campers on a night hike. They were dressed in black to play some sort of ninja-themed game, a harmless fun idea. They'd done it before, no issues. The trail they took was one that looped around the back edge of camp, going through one of the darker and more isolated sections of the forest. About halfway through the loop, just as they were on their way back, they passed a particularly shadowed patch of trees when they heard it. It started as a faint voice, a child's voice, off in the woods, just past the tree-line. It called out, "Help!" once, then again a little louder. Sadie thought it was strange. Maybe a kid had wandered off or someone was playing a prank. But something about the voice was wrong. She said it didn't sound like it was coming from any one direction. It was distant, but also kind of all around. Then it called out again, "Help!" But this time it sounded warped, like the pitch was off. She said it almost sounded like someone trying to sound like a child, but failing. By the third time, the voice had changed completely. Still the same words, but now the sound was more like a screech, high-pitched and strained, the kind of sound that makes your whole body tighten up. That's when she and the girls took off running back to camp. After hearing all that, I told her we should check it out. Maybe there really was a kid out there. It didn't sit right just ignoring it. So we grabbed a couple of flashlights and made our way toward the trail. We kept our steps slow and quiet, partly to listen and partly because neither of us wanted to go too fast toward whatever that sound had been. The trail itself was narrow and rocky, with thick shrubs on either side. The trees overhead blocked out most of the moonlight, so our flashlights barely seemed to make a dent. After about 10 minutes, we reached the spot Sadie said they'd heard the voice. It was still and cold, much colder than the rest of the forest, and the air smelled different, like damp leaves and something metallic, almost like rust. We stood there for a while, just listening. Then we heard it. "Help!" came from the hillside above us, but again, not from one spot. It echoed in a weird way, bouncing off the trees. The voice was sharp and tinny, like it was coming through an old speaker. Then it repeated, and this time the word was stretched out, twisted, almost glitching. My legs started to move on their own, backing away. I looked at Sadie and she was already turning. We didn't say a word. We just ran. We ran hard and fast, crashing through the trail, jumping over roots and ducking under branches. My flashlight bounced wildly, casting fast-moving shadows that made everything worse. Behind us, the voice kept calling out, but it was changing, warping even more, until it sounded like a scream choked through static. I've never run that hard in my life. My chest was on fire and my legs felt like they were giving out, but we didn't stop until we were back at the edge of camp. Once we reached the lights and the familiar cabins, we finally slowed down. My hands were shaking and I was soaked in sweat. We didn't go back to our cabins right away. Instead, we just sat on a bench near the main hall, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had happened. A few other counselors came by, and we told them what we'd heard. Of course, that set off a wave of wild theories. Ghosts, skinwalkers, lost campers, but no one had a real explanation. The next morning, the camp director called a meeting. We thought maybe they were going to ask us about what happened or maybe even shut down night hikes altogether. But instead, the director just calmly told us that some campers had been frightened by the sounds of bobcats in the woods. He explained that bobcats, especially during mating season, can make high-pitched, yelping sounds that carry through the forest. He said they're harmless, just part of the local wildlife. That was it. That was the whole explanation. No one mentioned the warped voice or the way it echoed through the hills. No one brought up how Sadie had panicked or how I'd nearly twisted my ankle sprinting back to camp. Just bobcats. I guess that's the thing. When you're out in the woods, far from the safety of cities and schedules and streetlights, your brain starts to fill in the blanks. Sounds don't always make sense. Shapes shift in the dark. And sometimes your imagination grabs onto something small and twists it into a nightmare. But even now, I'm not sure it was just bobcats. All I know is that whatever made that sound wasn't like anything I've heard before or since. And I still avoid that part of the trail when I'm walking alone. The rest of the summer, people joked about it. Sadie and I got called the Demon Hunters by the kitchen staff, and the story morphed into a full-blown ghost tale by the time the last week rolled around. But whenever someone asked me about it, I just smiled and shrugged. I didn't feel like laughing. Not really, because every now and then, when I'm walking at night and the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still hear it. A voice, faint and broken, calling out from the trees. Help. I've always liked going off the grid for a while. Clears my head, resets things. I work from a screen most days, and it starts to eat at me. So once or twice a year, I pack light, leave my phone off, and get out into the woods. I don't pick popular campgrounds with picnic tables and marked trails. I look for spots deep in, away from everything. Somewhere you don't see anyone for miles in any direction. That year, I picked a state forest up north that I hadn't camped in before. A friend mentioned it once. Said he'd heard it was underused and quiet, which was all I needed to hear. I looked it up, checked the satellite maps, and found a few likely spots near a creek system that stretched into the backcountry. I picked a location about 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. No paths led directly to it, but I'd mapped out a rough approach. I left early, parked where the road ended in a clearing, and started the hike in. The weather was good, cool, dry, overcast. I had my pack loaded with food, water, a tarp, small tent, some basic tools, and my old .22 pistol in case of snakes or coyotes. Nothing fancy. I wasn't planning on seeing anything dangerous, just some quiet time alone in the trees. The hike took longer than I expected. The terrain was rougher, with lots of deadfall and steep sections I didn't see on the satellite view. By the time I found a spot to set up, I was sweating through my shirt and ready to be done. It was a flat patch of ground up a small hill overlooking a bend in the creek. Trees surrounded it on 3 sides, thick and tall, but there was a little space to breathe. I cleared a spot, set the tent up, got my gear squared away, and then just sat for a while, listening to the wind and water. That first night was normal. I cooked some food on the little stove, sat near the creek, and went to bed early. I didn't even need to light a fire. The air was still and quiet. No bugs, no sounds of anything bigger than squirrels. That's what I liked about it. The next day, I hiked around a bit, followed the creek, tried some fishing. I saw one deer early in the morning, but other than that, nothing moved. No distant traffic sounds, no planes overhead, no voices. It was peaceful, just how I wanted it. I stayed close to camp that night, cooked again, and watched the sun go down behind the hill. When I turned in, I left the tent flap unzipped for air. The night was cool and clear. I woke up at some point in the night with the sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't loud, but something pulled me out of sleep. I laid still for a while, listening. It wasn't fear exactly, just alertness. Everything was quiet. No breeze, no bugs, nothing. That kind of silence has a weight to it. You feel it. I listened for a long time but didn't hear anything unusual. Just that dead silence. Eventually, I turned over and went back to sleep. The next morning was off somehow. I didn't feel rested. My legs ached more than they should have. I chalked it up to the hike in. When I stepped out of the tent, I looked around like I always do. Checked for animal tracks, branches knocked down, anything out of place. There was nothing obvious, but I still felt that weird edge, like something was just off. I went about my morning anyway, ate some breakfast, walked upstream a bit, tried fishing again. But I kept scanning the trees, couldn't settle. I thought maybe I was just out of practice being alone. I hadn't done a solo trip in almost a year. Maybe I just wasn't used to it anymore. So I told myself to relax. But around midday, I noticed something that really made me stop. I was walking a little further upriver, maybe a half mile from camp. It was a tight area with thick trees on both sides. I found a spot where the trees thinned out and stopped to drink water. That's when I saw something caught in the bark of a pine tree, about shoulder height, like it had been scraped. It was a piece of fabric, a small, torn corner of gray cloth, like from a jacket sleeve, faded, frayed, and clinging like it had been there a while. I pulled it off and turned it in my hand. Definitely not mine. I hadn't seen a soul on the way in, and this forest was supposed to be remote. That's why I picked it. I looked around for more signs. Boot prints, wrappers, broken branches, but there was nothing, just the creek and the trees. Still, it made me uncomfortable. Someone had been here, maybe recently, maybe not. But the idea of someone else being out here and staying hidden bothered me more than I expected. I took the fabric back to camp and stuffed it in a pocket. That night, I lit a small fire for the first time. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was nervous. I kept checking the tree line every few minutes, looking for movement. Nothing came, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. At one point, I thought I heard a branch snap downhill from my tent, but it might have been a deer or something heavier shifting in the brush. I stayed still, listening for more, but nothing followed. The next morning, I found a boot print in the soft earth near the edge of the camp. It wasn't mine. That changed everything. I knew right then I wasn't alone out there. Someone was watching, and they were close. My stomach dropped when I found it. The print was still fresh. The heel was sharp, the edges clean. It hadn't rained. There was no way that was mine. I hadn't walked out that way since I set up camp. I packed my gear quickly. I wanted to get out, but I was 6 miles from the road, and it was rough terrain. I figured I'd move during the day, stick close to the creek to avoid getting turned around, and make it back by dark. I kept the pistol on my hip the whole time. My heart didn't settle the entire day. Every little sound made me turn around. I thought I saw movement a few times out of the corner of my eye, but when I stopped to look, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. By the time the sun was going down, I hadn't made it all the way out. I was maybe 2 miles from the car. I could have pushed on, but the terrain was too uneven. It wasn't safe in the dark, so I made the call to set up camp again, just for one more night. I didn't like it, but it was better than twisting an ankle in the dark with nobody around. I found a low spot surrounded by thicker brush. It wasn't ideal, but I thought maybe the cover would give me some security. I didn't light a fire this time. I didn't cook. I just drank some water, ate a protein bar, and got inside the tent. I left my boots on. I kept the pistol next to my sleeping bag. That night was the worst. I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Branches cracking, leaves shifting, breathing. At one point, I thought I saw a faint flicker of light through the trees, like a flashlight beam, but it disappeared before I could focus on it. I laid still for hours, barely blinking. I didn't know if someone was circling the camp or if I was losing it. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something move directly outside the tent. Just one step, a shift in the leaves. Close, too close. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I waited. The sound didn't come again. No zipper, no footsteps walking away. Just that one shift in the leaves. I waited until first light before I moved again. The second I could see clearly, I packed everything in 5 minutes flat. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just walked fast. My legs were shaking, and my shoulders ached from the pack, but I didn't stop. When I got to the car, I checked everything. No damage, no signs anyone had touched it. I threw the pack in, locked the doors, and drove until I hit the nearest gas station. I sat in the lot for almost an hour before I calmed down enough to keep going. I didn't even tell anyone when I got home. I just unpacked, did laundry, and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. A few days later, I went online and started looking up missing persons in that area. There were a few, not many. Most were older, lost hikers' accidents. But one stood out. A man in his late 30s who went missing in the same state forest 5 years earlier. No trace found. His photo showed him wearing a gray jacket. I couldn't be sure, but the color looked like the torn fabric I found. I didn't tell anyone that part either. It didn't seem worth it. I wasn't sure what I had seen or heard, but I haven't gone camping since. Not alone. Not deep in the woods. Not after that. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe it was someone just like me trying to get away, staying quiet. Maybe they were harmless. Maybe they were scared of me too. Or maybe not. But I know what I saw. That boot print wasn't mine. That fabric didn't belong to me. Someone was out there and they knew exactly where I was. And the worst part is, I never saw them. Not once. They saw me, and they stayed just out of reach. I had been yearning for a solo camping trip to disconnect from the daily grind and immerse myself in nature. After weeks of planning, I settled on a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains, known for its dense forests, rugged terrain, and serene beauty. The thought of spending a few days alone in the wilderness was both exhilarating and daunting, but I was determined to embrace the challenge. In the days leading up to the trip, I meticulously gathered my gear: a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, a reliable backpacking stove, and enough food to last me for several days. I also packed a map, compass, and a GPS device to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Safety was paramount, so I informed a close friend of my itinerary and expected return date. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, with the last stretch winding through narrow, unpaved roads that led deep into the heart of the mountains. Upon arrival, I parked my car, hoisted my backpack, and set off into the wilderness. The trail was well marked initially, meandering through towering oaks and maples, their leaves forming a vibrant canopy overhead. After several hours of hiking, I veered off the main trail to find a secluded spot to set up camp. I stumbled upon a small clearing beside a gently flowing stream, a perfect location. The area was flat, surrounded by dense foliage, and offered easy access to water. I pitched my tent, ensuring it was on high ground to avoid any potential flooding, and set up a small fire pit a safe distance away. As dusk approached, I gathered firewood and prepared a simple meal. The crackling fire provided warmth and a comforting glow as I ate, the sounds of the forest serving as a natural symphony. The occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush reminded me of the vibrant ecosystem surrounding me. After extinguishing the fire, I crawled into my tent, the fatigue from the day's hike weighing heavily on me. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds, but one in particular caught my attention: a distant, rhythmic tapping. At first, I dismissed it as a woodpecker or perhaps branches knocking together in the breeze. However, as the night deepened, the tapping grew louder and more deliberate, echoing through the trees. Sleep eluded me as I lay there, ears straining to decipher the source of the noise. The tapping would start and stop intermittently, sometimes seeming closer, other times fading into the distance. An uneasy feeling settled over me, but I reassured myself that the wilderness was full of unfamiliar sounds, and there was likely a logical explanation. At first light, I emerged from my tent, eager to shake off the unease of the night. The forest was bathed in the soft glow of dawn, and the air was crisp and invigorating. I decided to explore the area around my campsite, hoping to find signs of wildlife or simply enjoy the beauty of the morning. As I wandered a short distance from my tent, I noticed something peculiar: a series of small, neatly arranged stacks of stones, known as cairns. They were positioned at regular intervals, leading deeper into the woods. While cairns are often used by hikers to mark trails, these seemed out of place, especially in such a remote area. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the line of cairns, each one leading me further from my campsite. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. After about 20 minutes of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing that sent a chill down my spine. In the center stood a makeshift structure, crudely built from branches and covered with a tattered tarp. Surrounding it were more cairns, some adorned with trinkets, rusty cans, fragments of cloth, and other miscellaneous items. The ground was littered with bones, some small and likely from animals, others larger and more ambiguous. A sense of dread washed over me as I took in the scene. It was clear that someone had been living here, or perhaps still was. The tapping from the previous night echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away, careful not to disturb anything. Retracing my steps, I followed the line of cairns back toward my campsite, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Upon reaching my tent, I quickly packed up my belongings, my hands trembling with urgency. As I hoisted my backpack and prepared to leave, I noticed fresh footprints in the damp earth near my campsite. Footprints that hadn't been there the day before. They were human, and they led from the direction of the makeshift shelter to the edge of my campsite before retreating back into the woods. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to leave immediately and put as much distance as possible between myself and whoever or whatever was out there. I set off at a brisk pace, constantly glancing over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts and fears. The forest, once a place of beauty and solace, now felt menacing and oppressive. Every sound was amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I pushed myself to move faster, driven by an overwhelming need to reach the safety of my car. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the dense woods onto the familiar path leading to the trailhead. Relief flooded over me as I spotted my vehicle, untouched and waiting. I quickly loaded my gear, started the engine, and drove away, the tension in my body slowly easing with each mile that separated me from that place. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I debated reporting the incident to the authorities but hesitated, unsure of what to say. I found a creepy shelter in the woods seemed insufficient, and I had no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. The experience left me with a profound respect for the unpredictability of the wilderness and a heightened awareness of the potential dangers that lurk beyond the beaten path. While I had sought solitude and adventure, I hadn't anticipated the unsettling encounter that would haunt my memories. I continued to cherish the outdoors, but with a renewed sense of caution. The forests are vast and mysterious, home to countless wonders, and perhaps a few secrets best left undisturbed. I had been planning this backpacking trip to the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho for months. The allure of rugged peaks, pristine alpine lakes, and the promise of solitude had drawn me in. I meticulously mapped out a route that would take me deep into the heart of the wilderness, where I could disconnect from the world and immerse myself in nature. The journey began at the Tin Cup trailhead near Pettit Lake. The trail was well-trodden, winding through dense forests of lodgepole pines and firs. The scent of pine needles filled the air, and the occasional rustle of wildlife kept me alert. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, the towering peaks of the Sawtooth Range loomed in the distance, their jagged silhouettes cutting into the clear blue sky. After a grueling day of hiking, covering approximately 8 miles with a significant elevation gain, I reached my intended campsite, a secluded valley nestled between two steep, rocky ridges. The valley floor was carpeted with soft grass and dotted with wildflowers, a stark contrast to the imposing cliffs that flanked it. A crystal-clear stream meandered through the valley, providing a reliable water source. I set up my tent near the stream, ensuring I was a safe distance from the water to avoid any unexpected rises during the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I prepared a simple meal over my portable stove. The tranquility of the valley was palpable, with only the gentle babbling of the stream and the distant call of a loon breaking the silence. As darkness enveloped the landscape, the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the exhaustion of the day's hike weighing heavily on me. The stillness of the night was comforting, and I quickly drifted into a deep sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a deep, rumbling sound. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be thunder echoing through the mountains. But as the sound grew louder and more intense, a cold realization washed over me. It was the unmistakable roar of a rockslide. The ground trembled beneath me as the cacophony of crashing boulders and snapping trees filled the air. The sound was deafening, a violent symphony of nature's raw power. My heart raced, and adrenaline surged through my veins. Panic threatened to take hold, but I forced myself to think rationally. Fumbling in the darkness, I considered my options. Running out of the tent seemed futile. The night was pitch black, and the uneven terrain was treacherous. Even if I could discern the direction of the rockslide, there was no guarantee I could outrun it or move to a safer location. The steep valley walls amplified the sound, making it nearly impossible to determine the exact source or trajectory of the falling rocks. I remembered reading about the unpredictability of rock slides in mountainous regions. They can be triggered by various factors: earthquakes, heavy rainfall, or even the freeze-thaw cycles that weaken rock formations over time. The Sawtooth Range, with its rugged geology, was no stranger to such events. In fact, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake had caused a significant rockslide in the area a few years prior, toppling the iconic Barron Spire. With no clear escape route and time running out, I made the split-second decision to stay put. I curled into a fetal position inside my sleeping bag, hoping that my location in the valley floor would be spared. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The relentless crashing continued, each impact sending shockwaves through the ground. I braced myself, fully expecting the tent to be obliterated at any moment. Gradually, the tumult began to subside. The crashes became more sporadic, eventually fading into an eerie silence. I remained motionless, ears straining for any sign of renewed activity. The only sound was the rapid thumping of my own heartbeat. Dawn was still a few hours away, and the darkness outside was impenetrable. Venturing out to assess the situation seemed unwise. I remained in my tent, sleep elusive as I replayed the harrowing experience over and over in my mind. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I cautiously unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The valley was bathed in a soft, golden glow, the tranquility belying the chaos of the night before. I scanned the surrounding area, half expecting to see a landscape scarred by the rockslide. To my astonishment, there were no visible signs of destruction. The trees stood tall, the stream flowed undisturbed, and the valley floor was untouched. It was as if the night's terror had been a figment of my imagination. But the lingering scent of disturbed earth and the faint haze of dust in the air told me otherwise. I ventured further, climbing a small rise to get a better vantage point. From there, I could see the steep ridges that framed the valley. High up on one of the slopes, a fresh scar marred the rock face, a section where boulders had broken free. The debris field was extensive, but it appeared that the majority of the rocks had come to rest long before reaching the valley floor. The realization of how close I had come to disaster sent a shiver down my spine. Had I chosen a campsite just a few hundred yards closer to the ridge, the outcome could have been fatal. The sense of helplessness I had felt during the rockslide was profound, a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability and my own vulnerability. Packing up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The wilderness had always been a place of solace for me, but this experience had unveiled its more menacing side. As I hiked out of the valley, each step took me further from the site of my near-miss, but the memory remained vivid. Back at the trailhead, I encountered a group of hikers preparing to embark on their own journey into the Sawtooths. I debated whether to share my experience, but ultimately decided against it. Everyone deserves their own adventure, untainted by the fears of others. However, I did make a mental note to always research potential hazards more thoroughly and to choose campsites with an even greater emphasis on safety. Reflecting on the incident, I realized that while the wilderness offers unparalleled beauty and serenity, it also demands respect and caution. The mountains are indifferent to human presence, and their power is both awe-inspiring and humbling. This experience, though terrifying, deepened my appreciation for the delicate balance between embracing adventure and acknowledging the inherent risks. In the end, I was grateful to be unharmed, to have witnessed nature's raw force, and to carry forward the lessons learned from that harrowing night in the Sawtooth Mountains. I had planned the trip for a couple of weeks, just a solo weekend in the woods with my shotgun and my bird vest, a chance to get away from everything. I wanted the quiet, the early mornings, the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional flutter of wings. Hunting upland birds isn't about trophies or meat so much as it is about the calm rhythm of walking, looking, listening, and being alone. I picked a state forest that wasn't too far from home but remote enough to not run into too many people. I had hunted there before, but never deep into the valley that ran through the center of it. It always seemed a little too thick and tangled, but I figured it might hold birds others had overlooked. It was late fall, leaves already down, and cold enough in the morning to bite at your fingertips. I got to the trailhead just after sunrise, parked off a narrow gravel pull-in, and shouldered my vest. I had my over-under 20 gauge slung low, safety on, action closed but unloaded. I didn't like to walk with shells chambered unless I was actively hunting cover. I wore a blaze orange cap, even though it wasn't deer season, just in case. I wanted to be seen. I had a sandwich and a thermos of coffee in my pack, along with my license and tags. I camped out the night before in a clearing maybe a mile up the trail and made a small fire ring with rocks. Nothing fancy, just enough to stay warm, cook, and sit in the dark for a while before crawling into my sleeping bag. That morning I was hiking a loop I'd planned out on the map, starting from my camp and cutting through a small valley that would connect to another ridgeline where I thought I might get into some grouse. The valley wasn't long, maybe 3/4 of a mile, and I thought it would save me time and let me cover more ground. The first 100 yards were normal. The trail was soft and covered in pine needles, and I could see the mist still hanging low between the trunks. Everything was damp. It was dead quiet. I walked slowly, scanning the trees, listening for any signs of birds. My eyes were on the understory, looking for movement, anything that looked like a flick of wings or a small brown body tucked near the ground. Then I came around a bend in the trail, and everything in me froze. About 40 yards ahead, just standing dead in the middle of the trail, was a man. He was holding an AR-15 at the low ready position, pointed downward but clearly ready to bring it up at a moment's notice. He didn't say anything. He wasn't walking, wasn't moving, just standing there staring back at me. I stopped, just dead stopped. My hand was still on the fore end of my shotgun, and I made sure to keep the barrel pointed down and away from him. I wasn't scared in the way you're scared of a bear or falling off a cliff. This was different. The air went out of me. My whole body knew something was wrong. The hair on my neck, my arms, even the backs of my legs. It all stood on end. Something about this guy was off. Way off. He looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. Dirty cargo pants soaked at the bottom, some ragged army-style jacket, boots covered in old mud. His face was sunken. He had maybe a couple of weeks' worth of gray stubble, but it didn't look grown. It looked neglected, like he stopped shaving not because he wanted to but because he couldn't care anymore. His eyes were sunk deep in their sockets, and his cheeks looked hollow. If you told me he hadn't eaten more than a can of beans in days, I'd believe it. He didn't have a pack, no gear, no orange, nothing to suggest he was there for any legal purpose. I knew deer season wasn't open. I knew you couldn't legally hunt deer in this state with an AR-15. I knew, more importantly, that a guy looking like this, standing in the middle of a trail in the middle of nowhere, holding a rifle, was not something you just casually walk past. My brain told me to act normal. Don't show fear. Don't challenge him. Don't raise your gun. Don't do anything sudden. My mouth went dry, but I swallowed and took a few slow steps forward. Not close, just enough to show I wasn't frozen. I raised my hand in a little half-wave. I didn't smile. I couldn't, but I tried to keep my face relaxed, like this was just another hiker, just another hunter out for the day. I made a gentle turn, like I was going to swing around him at a wide angle, but I was really watching his hands. If he raised that rifle, I don't know what I would have done. He didn't raise it. He just stood there, eyes locked on me. I asked something simple. I don't even remember my exact words. Just something to the effect of asking where I might find birds in the area. Something that didn't challenge him, didn't accuse him, didn't ask why he was there. I hoped he'd get the hint and point me away. His voice was flat, cold. He said something about deer, something that didn't add up. His tone was odd. He gave me a direction back the way I'd come. I took the hint. I nodded, said thanks, or maybe I just nodded again. I turned around slowly, and I walked. I didn't run. I didn't speed up. I just walked. Every step I expected to hear something behind me. A footstep, a gunshot, anything, but it stayed quiet. I walked back up that trail for what felt like hours. My back crawled the whole time. I didn't stop until I'd cleared the valley and gotten halfway up the opposite ridge. Then I broke off the trail into thick brush and circled around, just in case he was watching. I made a wide arc through the woods, moving fast, checking over my shoulder every couple of minutes. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. When I got back to my camp, I packed fast. No coffee, no lunch. I rolled everything tight and shoved it into my pack, crushed my fire ring flat with my boot, and hiked straight out to the car. I didn't load my shotgun, but I kept it in my hands the whole way out. My eyes never stopped moving. When I got back to the car, I threw everything in and drove straight to the ranger station near the highway. I told the guy at the desk everything. He wrote it down, asked me to describe the man, asked for the time and location. I don't know if anything came of it. I never got a follow-up. I don't think they found anyone. The weirdest part is that I stayed calm. Through the whole thing, I didn't shake. I didn't panic. I didn't break into a run. I didn't cry until I got home that night, sitting in my kitchen holding a beer with both hands, replaying it over and over in my head. That man could have killed me. He had a weapon, the upper hand, and the look of someone with nothing left to lose. And he didn't. I don't know why. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe he was just paranoid, living out in the woods hiding from something. Maybe he had something to protect down that trail, a camp, a meth lab, who knows. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I wasn't supposed to be there. He made that clear without saying it outright. And I got out. That's the part that sticks with me more than anything, that I got out. I went home. I lived. I haven't hunted that area again. I stick to spots closer to home now, places where I know the land and the people. I still think about that morning sometimes, how close I probably came, how a calm voice and a non-threatening posture might have been the only things that saved me. If you spend enough time in the woods, you learn to respect all kinds of dangers, weather, animals, terrain. But the scariest thing out there is still other people, especially the ones you don't see coming.